Happy 829th anniversary of the Spanish win in the Battle of Alarcos. This was arguably the beginning of the full push towards the Reconquista, also known as the Spaniards kicking out the Arab Muslim caliphates out of Spain, which had been controlling the Iberian Peninsula for almost 500 years by that point. It would still take until 1492 for all of Spain to be completely free. Talking about being complete though, today we have the second part of what Blizzard announced yesterday, and we are talking about the set of balance tuning. Yesterday was focused on tanks and the major shift in philosophy around tanking in the War Within. What we have for today are several changes to DPS specs, but also quite a few to healers, because yesterday we mentioned, yeah, these changes for tanks are cool, but we need to see, first of all, some changes to healers to also accommodate for these tanks taking more damage, so presumably more or stronger single target healing spells, and then also possibly some changes to the way tanks take damage in the first place. One of these changes is already here, because Blizzard is reducing the damage modifier of Fortified from 30 to 20%. So you have a flat out 10% weaker consistent damage taken by tanks and also by all players in a Mythic Plus key, first of all. Then, as far as the actual spec changes, we have DK, which is hit mostly with nerfs. Yes, on top of the nerfs to Blood, Frost, Unholy, and two of their hero talents also get nerfed. We have looked at, we have them right here, the results in the beta, in the raid for example, and we mentioned Frost and Unholy, both of them being amongst the better performers, so this also makes sense. The major changes go to the nerfs of Rider of the Apocalypse. This one hits mostly Frost, because they were the largest user of this hero talent tree. Pretty much just flat out nerfs to the damage of the Riders themselves or the buffs that the Riders gave to your abilities, as well as nerf to Frost itself. Glacial Advance, Icy Death Torrent particularly are being nerfed. Icy Death Torrent was one of the recently newly mega buffed set of abilities given to Frost DK, which was giving them a lot of damage, in particular in AoE, since that's kind of the point of Icy Death Torrent, passive AoE damage coming from your auto attacks, and then your Glacial Advance AoE spender is also getting nerfed. Unholy also catches some nerfs. You have Ebon Fever ramping up less disease damage, Bursting Sore nerfs across the board for Unholy DK, so again, some AoE themed focused nerfs for Unholy, together with the nerfs given to Frost DK. And as we mentioned, those were mostly in line with the performances of the specs. These were just in the raid. They were doing equally good in Mythic Plus as well, in terms of AoE damage, for example, so not too surprising. What might come perhaps as somewhat surprising are the set of buffs given to Resto Druid, because Resto Druid is receiving an astounding amount of buffs. We have mentioned them being overall the weaker performer, right? When we went over the raid performances, them, Holy Priest and Discipline Priest were quite weak, but they have now gone 3 set of patches in a row of consistent buffs. Some of these are compensation buffs to single target abilities because of the nerfs given to tanks. So, Regrowth, Initial Heal is increased by 30%, Swiftmend single target heal, and then Life Bloom heals, and then Scenario Ward single target heals are all buffed also by 20%. On top of that though, you also get both of the hero talents significantly buffed. In particular, absurdly buffed is Keeper of the Grove. Keeper of the Grove was your practically only choice in the raid, as the synergistic pick with your Grove Guardians, and also the Dream Surge creating extra healing for you whenever you actually use a Grove Guardian. This gets buffed even more. First of all, the Dream Bloom itself, so the actual effect of the heal, is buffed by 20%. You then have a flat heal increase to most of your abilities. Reju, Efflorescence, and Life Bloom are buffed by 5%, and then Regrowth, Wild Growth, and Swiftmend are buffed by 3%. Even stronger is Bounteous Bloom. Grove Guardian healing is increased by 30%. This is relevant because Grove Guardians are a significant part of your total healing. This one being buffed by this much is very strong, and more importantly than any of this is Harmony of the Grove. Now, you get 6% more healing for each active Grove Guardian instead of 3. So when you have all 3 Grove Guardians out at once, that's 18% more healing instead of 9. Don't forget, as a Druid, you can also play with Incarn, and the follow-up of Incarn, which is during Incarnation, you summon a Grove Guardian every 10 seconds. So this number of Harmony of the Grove will go even higher than just 3. So it is just a quite significant buff to the overall healing of Restoration Druid. And then you also get Willstalker buffed. This is still positive. You were still never going to play this in the raid, but it's just extra value in Mythic Plus, where you were already strong as a Resto Druid. Most of the grievances of the results of the Resto Druid were themed around the raid, not nearly as much for Mythic Plus. So this buff is just extra gravy for you as a Resto Druid. But they likely won't even be the winningest healer in the set of buffs received by healers in this set of tuning, because right after them we have Evoker. So okay, first of all you have Devastation. Devastation was decreed to be slightly too weak by Blizzard, so they are getting buffed by basically 10%. All their abilities you can think of, from Disintegrate and Fire Breath, which are also buffed for Preservation, for example, also their own specific spec abilities like Eternity Surge, Pyre, Shattering Star, all of them are buffed by 10%. You have the 97th set of nerfs to the HP of the Augmentation buff. Remember, this HP buff used to be 10%, now it's down to 2%. And the aspect of the favors increase is now 1% max health per talent point instead of 2%. So even more nerfs, which will still keep Augmentation as a super strong pick in Mythic Plus, but at this point we have given up hoping any significant changes go in the way of Augmentation. The biggest changes in here for Evoker are to Preservation. So Preservation does get, just like Resto Druid, some compensation buff to their single target healing. So they get Living Flame buffed by 30%. They then get also Spirit Bloom buffed by 20%. You have Pandemic refresh duration added to Reversion, and then the other single target heal, Verdant Embrace, buffed by 20%. Now these buffs hit a little bit harder for Evoker in single target because these can also be used in AoE. A Resto Druid can only heal with Swiftmend on one target or with Life Bloom on one target or two target with the talent, but for an Evoker who has spread Echo to 15 players, also thanks to Temporal Anomaly, they can use, for example, Verdant Embrace to hit 15 targets at once. They can use Living Flame to hit 15 targets at once. They can use also Spirit Bloom to hit 15 targets at once. So these, while being single target buffs, are also functionally AoE buffs, possibly for Evoker. But these aren't even the good buffs that Preservation is getting. The good buffs are, number one, Engulf can now be stored in stasis. This is a massively powerful change if you're playing Flameshaper, which is the bursty version of Preservation, because the playstyle is that when you use Engulf, you consume 4 seconds of Dream Breath. And now this can be stored in stasis. This effect can be stored in stasis. And for the record, you have 2 charges now, which means you can store 2 of these in stasis. As you enable stasis, cast a couple of these and then a full rank Spirit Bloom, so that you can then go back the next time the boss is doing some heavy damage, use a couple of Temporal Anomalies, a few Echoes, Verdant Embrace to tag 10, 15, 20 players with Life Bind, and then re-enable stasis and get these explosions spread across many players, still with Life Bind running on them for even more AoE healing. On top of that, by this point you have gotten one of your charges of Engulf back, so you are casting 2 of them from stasis and you can cast a third one by yourself. This is a massive burst of healing for Evoker. What is also even better is something that comes all the way back from Dragonflight Beta for Preservation, which is Lifebind will now trigger its healing from heals that are considered procs. Right now, this very powerful passive only counts your direct healing and your direct hots, like for example the ones from Dream Breath, but not all of your free procs, all of your random stuff that can happen as part of your healing kit, fluttering seedlings running around or randomly spawning an extra blossom or something like golden hour effect. None of this is counted as part of the shared healing of Lifebind. Now it will be. So it is now making Lifebind even stronger than before and pushing you even more towards playing with Verdant Embrace and proccing a lot of Lifebinds for then more healing. This overall is by far the largest buff given to a healer, which will likely, I don't really want to jinx it, but likely will have to be nerfed or fixed in some way because it's quite too strong if it works as intended from the patch notes. Talking about working as intended, there is something that is not working as intended, which is Hunter, which is Marksmanship Hunter, and it's Sentinel Marksmanship Hunter. They get another set of nerfs with Symphonic Arsenal now having a 5 target cap and proccing every 2 seconds instead of every 1. Yes, the damage is doubled. So you double the damage of Sentinel, but now it's only on 5 targets. So it is a now stronger, basically much stronger now in single target. So in raids, in boss fights, that is making the Hero Talent 3 stronger. But where it was really strong was in AoE, where a third of your damage practically was coming from this Hero Talent. Now it's got a 5 target cap. So you have practically the same problem of your entire spec, of your trick shots and your limited number of targets. Now Sentinel is practically following the same problem as Marksmanship Hunter as a whole. It's a very bad nerf for marksmanship, especially in Mythic Plus. It is also bad, worth mentioning, for Survival, because Survival was also doing quite well in the beta, and it does hurt them, but not nearly as much as Marksmanship Hunter. After them, we have nerf number 17 for Arcane. Yep, because first you have the nerf to Mage, which is now your mass barrier having a 1 minute longer cooldown. Okay, this should be removed from the game. You shouldn't have a higher cooldown. But then the nerfs to Arcane, yet another nerf to your Spellslinger Hero Talent, Embedded Arcane Splinter and Splinter Storm have all of their damage reduced by 20%, and then Arcane Orbs generated for free generate fewer splinters, so even more nerfs to the Hero Talent. But then also Arcane itself catches a fix to a particularly degenerate playstyle. Arcane Barrage damage is reduced by a whopping 60%. However, Arcane Barrage damage now increases by 90% per charge. Currently, it only increases 30% per charge. This means that at full charges, at 4 Arcane charges, the old Arcane Barrage was doing 120% more damage. The new Arcane Barrage is doing 360% more damage. So Blizzard tripled the AoE, the cleave for target damage of Arcane Barrage, but significantly nerfed the single target damage of Arcane Barrage. Yes, you also caught some single target nerfs, Arcane Missiles and Arcane Orb, flat out nerfed by 10%, but the reason why this is happening is because Blizzard had been changing so much the damage of Arcane Barrage and Arcane Blast and Arcane Missiles, and this got to the point where Arcane Missiles was basically the strongest thing you wanted to cast, also because of the amount of freebie things you were getting whenever you got clear casting. Nowadays, Arcane Missiles is only castable in clear casting, so Arcane players realized the best way to get all of these clear casts and benefit from all of that is to simply spam 0 charge Arcane Barrages until you actually get to have your clear casts. And quite a few other parts of your rotation, like for example Arcane Blast, were being somewhat ignored for just casting more and more often Arcane Barrages at 0 charges, not doing that much damage, just because you were fishing for clear casting. So this change is meant to fix this problem and stop you from spamming Arcane Barrage even when it does no damage. Ironically, right now, the meme is that now spamming Arcane Explosion in single target is practically going to do the same thing as spamming Arcane Barrage. So perhaps we're going to have to fix this problem as well for the Arcane Mage rotation in single target. Now, we do have a few changes, albeit not perhaps very positive, for monks. I'm afraid getting away with a slap on the wrist only happened for Brewmaster yesterday. You have flat out nerfs across Master of Harmony to the DPS for Brewmaster. That was the hero talent taken, and the damage happening mostly for Brewmaster, so you have quite a few nerfs to the hero talent of Brewmaster. You also have some changes to Mistweaver, as mentioned. Some of them are going to be the compensation single target healing buffs given to Mistweaver, buffed Ancient Teachings and your fist weaving power even more now with this set of changes, and then Windwalker catches practically an 8% damage nerf. Across the board, most of their damage was just nerfed by 8%. Windwalker was in the top half of results across the board. They weren't, doing extremely well or like super top in general. They were doing well. It's perhaps a bit surprising to see them receive this kind of nerfs. We then have changes to Paladin, which are not that many because most of them are just changes to Lightforge Blessing, affecting 2 targets instead of 4. Compensation single target healing buffs. You have Word of Glory buffed by 10% and Flesh of Light buffed by 20%. Those are pretty much the only 2 changes happening to Paladin. Priest also gets a bunch of compensation healing changes to their single target heals. Flash Heal, Power Shield, Power of Life, Penance, Heal, Holy War Serenity, and the single target healing of your Divine Image are all being buffed by 20%. In line with the other, single target buffs to the other specs. We now have, though, the biggest buff of the day when it comes to the DPS, because this one is to Enhancement Shaman. We do have before this the similar compensation healing buffs to Restoration Shaman. Healing Surge is buffed by 20%, Riptide, Unleash Life, Healing Wave all buffed by 20%. Mage or QOL, if you were trying to play Farseer in the raid, which you likely would not, is to make your Ancestor last for 12 seconds whenever you use Unleash Life instead of 6 seconds. And then Major, cooldown nerf to Resto Shaman, Ancestral Guidance now transferring 10% of all healing instead of 25%. This is major because with the now cooldown reduction to Ascendance, making it a 2-minute cooldown, you could perfectly line up Ascendance with Ancestral Guidance and make them synergize greatly. Now, it's not that great anymore. It's still an amazing set of cooldowns, it's just slightly more annoying that this talent has to be weakened so much just because of the synergy with another spell. But going back to the buff of the day is the one to Enhancement. First, the QOL. Primordial Wave now has a 30-second cooldown instead of 45, and Doom Winds has a 60-second cooldown instead of 90-second cooldown. So this is already pretty good, especially because Enhancement still has the Splintered Element buff given to Primordial Wave, so massive haste buffs, especially in Mythic Plus with multiple targets, so having this on a 30-second cooldown can give you more uptime of this very powerful buff. Then you have QOLs, which are still very good because casting any one of your Shocks or Sundering now automatically puts you in melee auto-attack combat. This was a rather frustrating feature of playing Enhancement, not starting your auto-attacks whenever you pulled mobs or started your combat with this. More QOL because Molten Assault now has a 4-yard range, so practically spreading your Flame Shock is 5 yards wider, and Crush Lightning now also has a 4-yard wider range for better reach of your AoE. But that's not the best though, because the best is the following talents are now 1 point. Molten Assault, Improved Maelstrom Weapon, and Witch Doctor's Ancestry. So this one is now 1 talent point, this one is now 1 talent point, and this one is now 1 talent point. So you now have 3 free talent points to spend elsewhere. Technically you have 2 free talent points because you got given the Flurry from your general talent tree, so you gained 1 more point to spend. Now you got 3 free points to spend, so in total you have 2 free points to put elsewhere. For example, in this talent setup, you couldn't have picked Splintered Elements and you couldn't have picked Thorin's Invocation because you had to put 1 more point here and 1 more point here that you now no longer need to do because you have free talent points. This is smoothing out your reach of options much more. There are now multiple builds flying around, the Shaman community trying to wrap their heads around, is it time now, can we afford now to play with Storm Flurry, can we now play more openly with Sundering, can we also afford to play with Doom Winds even if we're not going down the Storm build, for example. Are we now, even as a Storm spec, finally able to go all the way down the Primordial Wave line that we couldn't before? All of these things are being opened up by giving you a bunch of free extra talent points by skimming down on the 2-point talents of Enhancement. So definitely the biggest win as far as DPS changes go. The last of the changes are to Warlock. You have not as much of a nerf, but just a slight change. You are getting your Wither to do 20% more damage flat because your follow-up talent to empower Wither is being nerfed by 20% in order to make the other option of the talent more of a choice, more of a possible option rather than just always defaulting to Hate Fury rituals for Hellcaller. You have a couple of bug fixes. These were supposed to be working in the first place. A very tiny buff to Succulent Soul, increasing the damage of your Hand of Gul'dan, not that relevant given that Hand of Gul'dan doesn't do that much damage, and then some more incentive of destruction to pick Shadowburn by increasing its damage by 80%, as well as then 5% and 10% more damage buffs to Incinerate, Soulfire, Channel Demon Fire, and Summon Infernal, given that at the moment Destruction Warlock wasn't exactly amongst the better performing specs based on the results in the beta so far. These have been overall all of the non-tank centric changes in the beta following the major tank changes announced yesterday by Blizzard. So expected some sort of compensation to healers to also allow them to help with stronger single target healing, with the expected more consistent damage intake of tanks after being nerfed in their sustain. Some extra, because specs like Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker also got some extra buffs on top of that. Nerfs to some of the better performing specs in the beta right now, namely Arcane, Frost Decay, and Unholy Decay, as well as the AoE power of Sentinel for marksmanship and also somewhat for survival. And the biggest winner in terms of buffs for today, in terms of DPS, being Enhancement Shaman. This is the recap of the latest set of changes for balance tuning in the War Within beta. So for today, on this Thursday, I believe, we are now leaving each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, for everyone who has watched the video, as well as any more ways to support for free by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. For now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, this time I didn't even procrastinate that much. Only about 3 hours of doing nothing before I started making the video.